a previous Pope wrote the shroud was, quote, a truly mysterious image which no human artistry was capable of producing. Lara, but we have the book, the broadcast, and now the app.
For centuries, a single cloth has baffled the world. A linen relic said to carry the face of a crucified man. Scientists called it myth. Believers called it proof. But then artificial intelligence entered the debate. What it uncovered was not a picture, not a stain, but something stranger. Hidden geometry, repeating codes, a design that should not exist in the fibers of ancient linen. Was it accident, miracle, or something we were never meant to see? What secret is the Shroud of Turin still hiding? The cloth that defied time. The Shroud of Turin is not only a relic, 'tis a story that refuses to end. 'Tis 14 feet of linen and just over 3 feet of width, woven in a herringbone twill that catches light like a ripple on still water. On its surface lies the faint image of a man, head to heels, front and back, as if a body had rested there and then departed without creasing the fabric, leaving only a ghost. The wounds read like a narrative carved into fiber. Wrist marks aligned where nails would enter, a blood-like stain at the feet, an oval on the side that suggests a spear thrust, faint circles that look like a crown of thorns pressed into scalp. The face does not shout, it hovers, eyes closed. Beard parted, hair falling in strands that seem to float above the weave, as if the cloth and the image once knew distance. The first documented display appears in France during the 13th century in a small town. That turned into a destination for pilgrims and a proving ground for doubts. Crowds gathered, priests processed. Skeptics accused the church of inventing a spectacle. The cloth moved through hands and houses until the House of Savoy brought it to Tin, where in 1578 it began its long vigil interrupted by fire and smoke and rescue. Today it rests in a climate-controlled case within the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, where glass and steel protect it from time and time protects it from certainty. No single moment altered its status more than a photograph in 1898. The lawyer, Ciondopia, set up his plates and lamps and worked in the dim heat of an improvised dark room. When he developed the negative, he expected a muddle of tones. Instead, a face stared back with startling clarity. The negative looked like a positive. The faint image on the cloth became a strong portrait on film. Cheekbones emerged. Lips defined themselves. Hair separated into strands. Hands crossed over the pelvis gained shape and proportion. That reversal was not proof of anything except that the image interacted with light in a way that ordinary paint would not. Yet, it changed the conversation. The relic crossed from devotion into problem. The laboratory joined the chapel. Across the 20th century, the cloth endured methods as patient as they were invasive. Chemists peeled fibers and tasted them with reagents. Microscopes walked the surface. Forensic examiners noted that the blood-like areas stained the threads rather than the image staining the blood. Textile historians measured the twist of yarn and compared it with looms known to the Levant. Pollen researchers reported grains consistent with the flora of the Eastern Mediterranean. Each result seemed to bend the debate rather than end it. There was no portrait made of Jesus, so really the shroud still remains the best single thing that we have. Nothing conclusive enough to silence critics. Nothing trivial enough to plate believers. The shroud kept doing what it always does. It gave just enough evidence to make the next experiment necessary. The image itself refused to behave like pigment. No binder layer, no brush strokes in any direction. No capillary penetration deep into the thread. The discoloration appears to sit on the crowns of the outermost fibrils, as if kissed by light and left alone. Depth maps built from intensity showed a correlation between image darkness and the theoretical distance from a body's surface, which is an extraordinary claim and yet a measurable one. If a cloth lay closer to nose and forehead and farther from the cheeks, the darkness should vary with separation. Many attempts to reproduce that gradient with heat or vapor or chemical reaction produced effects that were close but not exact. The shroud remains singular, which is a polite way to say that it sat there while hypotheses came and went. There's nobody else in history who's ever been described as being crucified like this. How can it not be? Then came the fire of analysis about age. In 1988, 3 laboratories received thread from one corner of the cloth. They measured radiocarbon content and published a date between the 13th and 14th centuries. That verdict was clean and final to many readers. A medieval origin wrapped the mystery in one sentence, but even a clean sentence can hide a clause. The sample site was a corner near an edge that had known handling, repair, and smoke. Textile specialists argued the portion could include later threads introduced during a medieval reweave. Others raised concerns about how the sample was cleaned. A few noted that a single region cannot speak for a heterogeneous artifact that has lived a hard life. The debate did not die. It mutated. If the date is right, the image is an astonishing medieval work. If the date is wrong, the age is open. The cloth continued to resist reduction. That is how the shroud carried its paradox into our century. A picture that behaves like a negative before photography. A surface effect without pigment. A depth relationship that hints at spatial information. A contested age that may tell us more about sampling than about origin. A case that invites both reverence and rigor. Within that tension, a new voice arrived. It did not bring belief or disbelief. It brought computation. It brought the habit of learning from patterns so faint the eye cannot see them and so large the mind cannot hold them. The machine was not offended by the question. It was built to ask a better one. What precisely is in this image that we have not measured yet? If photography revealed the face and chemistry mapped the fibers, what happens when a system designed to find structure in chaos listens to linen? The dating controversy. The Radiocarbon campaign of 1988 was the most definitive moment in the modern history of the shroud because it promised closure. Oxford, Zurich, Arizona. 3 laboratories, 1 protocol, a piece of cloth snipped from a corner and divided among the teams. Cleaned, combusted, converted to graphite, and counted in accelerators that translate isotopes into years. The world expected clarity and received a neat window. Between 1260 and 1390, newspapers printed the range and called it decisive. Museum voices relaxed. The story seemed over. The corner chosen has since become one of the most analyzed places in any artifact on Earth, the lower left region, where countless hands may have touched and where repairs may have occurred after a documented fire in the 16th century. Textile chemist Raymond Rogers argued that the corner fiber showed chemical differences from the main field, including cotton intermingled with linen and residues consistent with dye or mending. If that corner includes later material, then the sample would skew modern. The reply from defenders of the test is that laboratories validated their cleaning and checked the homogeneity. The counter is that heterogeneous repair can pass a cursory check while still being significant, enough to alter radiocarbon content. These segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there is no question about them. The debate lives in that narrow seam between confidence and caveat. Other methodologies joined the conversation not to overthrow radiocarbon, but to widen the lens. Wide-angle X-ray scattering analysis of cellulose order in ancient textiles has produced age estimates that in some trials tend toward an earlier date than the medieval range. Critics caution that humidity, heat, and storage conditions can alter the signal, which means calibration is complex and error bars are large. Supporters respond that every method carries sensitivities and that convergence across techniques matters more than any single measurement. Even pollen work enters here. The presence of grains from species native to the Levant does not prove origin. It suggests movement or exposure. In conjunction with weave pattern studies and herb residues reported by some investigators, It paints a partial picture that is consistent with antiquity without being a proof of it. The most striking aspect of this controversy is how it turns on access. The shroud is not a lab sample. It is a guarded relic. Sampling is sparse and conservative, as it should be for preservation. That means any one test leans heavy on a small region. The physics of probability then does something merciless. A small misrepresentation at the sample site can dominate the conclusion. A few threads become a thesis. A section near a seam becomes a century. The scientific instinct is to sample more and on a grid. The custodial instinct is to protect. Between those instincts, the argument intensifies. We have a picture. Then that means everything about this picture should fit into what we know about forensics today. If the 1988 date is exactly right, then the shroud is a medieval creation of genius. That does not clear up the image formation, because no known medieval technique reproduces the superficiality and the spatial mapping. If the date is off, then the field reopens, not to certainty, but to a range that includes the first centuries of the Common Era. That is not proof that the cloth wrapped Jesus. It only restores the question that belief asks and science tests. Within that restored question, artificial intelligence arrives like a referee who does not care who wins. It does not touch the corner. It touches the data. It asks what can be learned without cutting another thread. No one should imagine that AI can date linen. It cannot. What it can do is examine the image at resolutions and frequencies and transforms that make structures speak louder than noise. It can test whether intensity variations follow shapes expected from contact or from projection or from some other field effect. It can compare the way blood-like areas interact with image areas and tell whether order implies process. It can examine symmetry that the eye sees and symmetry that only a matrix reveals. It is not a replacement for carbon counting or for cellulose scattering. It is a companion that says the argument about when should not stop the investigation into how. When a method says case closed, but an effect says not yet, the correct response is not to choose a side. It is to design a new test. The shroud invites that test because it keeps whispering anomalies. 3. Technology enters the tomb. The shift from lenses and reagents to algorithms began quietly. High-resolution photographs of the shroud have existed for decades, including multispectral sets that capture ultraviolet fluorescence and infrared response. What changes when you feed those images into a system trained to detect weak signals is not only quantity, it is kind. Principal component analysis peels variance away from variance. Convolutional nets search for recurring shapes. Frequency filters expose periodic behavior hidden in the weave. These techniques do not add information. They rearrange it so patterns climb above randomness. When that rearrangement first lit up the screen, a few observers expected confirmation of what the eye already knew. A face, a torso, hands, stains. Instead, the analysis returned something unsettling. It showed order that did not look like brush or stamp or transfer. It looked like a rule no one had written down. Before that moment, 3D simulations had tested an older question. If a cloth had draped a human body and the image formed by contact, then areas that touched would mark heavily, and areas that did not touch would mark lightly or not at all. That kind of contact map produces distortions, especially along shoulders and cheeks and fingers. Some digital artists draped virtual cloth over a model and rendered theoretical impressions. The distortions in those tests did not match the relatively undistorted proportions on the shroud. When the cloth was imagined over a shallow relief rather than a full volume, the fit improved. The conclusion was not that the shroud sat on a sculpture. It was that contact alone did not generate what the linen holds. Something more like distance mapping seemed to be involved. Enter AI with eyes indifferent to romance. The system examined pixel intensity as a proxy for image depth and found a correlation that persists across sections. Darker meant nearer within a band of tolerance. Lighter meant farther. If someone painted an image by hand, even with astonishing skill, such a correlation would likely break down at small scales. If someone transferred pigment from a bas relief through pressure, fibers would show directionality and penetration inconsistent with the superficiality measured in microscopic surveys. The image on the shroud behaves as if something encoded spatial information without leaving mass behind. These are careful words for a reason. There is no claim that the cloth received a projection. There is no claim that radiation burned pattern into linen. There is only the observation that when intelligent tools ask what kind of order best explains the relationship between intensity and form, the order resembles a mathematical surface more than a painterly one. The discoloration sits in the caps of fibrils, to depths of microns. The color change does not continue into the core. The edges are soft and unify across thread boundaries rather than clogging inner stasis. Even laser experiments conducted by independent groups have struggled to reproduce such a shallow uniform effect on linen without scorching or diffusion. A graphics team in upstate New York is preparing a very different kind of resurrection. The question that follows is not theological. It is physical. What process could impart energy so precisely that it alters only the top of the outer fibers, and does so in a gradient that tracks distance? When researchers layered spectrally distinct images into the same analytic framework, they noticed a second oddity, a faint symmetry appearing around parts of the face and chest that did not match known fabric folds or camera artifacts. The pattern repeated across transforms. It survived the removal of obvious noise. It persisted when regions were randomized to serve as controls. Healthy skepticism calls such findings artifacts until proven otherwise. Healthy curiosity refuses to discard a repetition that keeps returning when methods change. If this image is an accident of contact, we should see disorder. If it is an artwork, we should see tool marks. If it is neither, we have met a process we do not yet possess. What AI just found? The phrase "just found" can mislead if it suggests discovery without history. What AI uncovered in the shroud was not conjured from nothing, but drawn from data already present, overlooked until a machine traced its outlines. Beneath the face and torso, patterns surfaced, ratios echoing across brow, lip, and Mayan chin. Faint curves mirroring ribs and shoulders. Even the blurred hands shared recurrences that did not match the weave. The geometry persisted under ultraviolet and visible light, surviving tests that should have broken illusions. How can symmetry hide in fabric for centuries unnoticed? Skeptics proposed confirmation bias, as networks often see faces in clouds or toast. To avoid that trap, researchers used neutral techniques like principal component analysis, stripping away any preloaded assumptions. Even then, the result did not coalesce into a face. It resolved into a field where brightness rose and fell as if obeying a law rather than an artist's brush. If this is a law, what kind is it? Can cloth behave like a map of unseen forces rather than a passive canvas? Others warned of halos or false symmetries born in image processing. Analysts therefore returned to raw captures from different decades. Cameras and filters. The structure remained. Control linens treated with heat or stains produced artifacts, but not the same ratios. The conclusion was cautious but important. The shroud's image is not unique, but it is different. We actually get a glimpse though, maybe through a glass darkly. But when we look at the image on the shroud, I think we're getting if not a camera trick or weave illusion, then what force held the geometry stable across light bands? The presence of blood-like stains raised new questions. Instead of confusing the geometry, the stains seemed irrelevant. The ratios continued beneath them, indifferent to added layers. This suggested the image and the stains were created by separate processes. If true, then the mystery deepens. Did one event mark the cloth chemically while another etched its geometry? Or does the cloth record two overlapping but unrelated histories? Eventually, whispers grew louder. If the image looks like a field, perhaps it came from one. Models of corona discharge, ultraviolet bursts, and electrostatic events have been tested, but none explain the shallow, precise coloring or the distance mapping. Researchers admitted the mechanism remains unknown. One physicist put it plainly: this does not behave like an artifact. It behaves like a phenomenon. What kind of phenomenon writes order onto linen without tools? Could it be chemical, physical, or something not yet named? Echoes in the scientific world. The shroud lives in two arenas. One is public, where headlines shout miracle or hoax. The other is private, where emails circulate and experiments repeat in silence. Within that quieter circle, AI's findings spread carefully. Teams tried adversarial tests to break the geometry, but failed. Others sought echoes in old linens, but none showed the same persistence. One Italian group called it spatial intelligence and degradation. An American team called it a decaying signal. Both terms suggest mystery, not solution. Do these metaphors point us forward, or only keep us circling the unknown? Theology reacted in familiar fashion. Some believers claimed the pattern was a fingerprint of resurrection. Others urged restraint, reminding that science cannot reproduce the event if it happened once. Faith can live with uniqueness, but science resists it. Still, many scientists did not object to uniqueness itself. What they feared was haste. If claims outrun evidence, credibility collapses. The rhythm must be measure, repeat, publish, and invite doubt. Can this rhythm survive in a world hungry for quick headlines? The Vatican remains silent, likely cautious after centuries of controversy. The custodians know any statement will be weaponized by both sides. Better to let data speak. Meanwhile, in the tech world, AI earned a strange respect. It neither blessed nor mocked the relic. It counted. It mapped. It asked for more counting. Could this neutrality, free from belief or disbelief, make AI the fairest judge the shroud has ever had? Artificial intelligence having something to say about the shroud as well. But new questions multiplied. Does the pattern appear only in the face and chest? Does it weaken near limbs? Does it follow thread direction or ignore it? Could advanced microscopy confirm whether fibril crowns carry the same superficial color everywhere? Could a new Radiocarbon plan, blind and multi-rean, finally silence the dating debate? Or will access always be too restricted? Each question promised years of work. Which will researchers choose first? What if the shroud is not alone? Could there be cousins in museums or private collections? Fabrics marked with similar superficial images, faint geometries, or distance mapping. If one cousin is found, the mystery becomes natural. If none exist, the shroud stands isolated, raising the stakes higher. Which possibility is more unsettling? Natural kinship or lonely uniqueness? And if uniqueness holds, does that make the shroud a gift, a trick, or a riddle we may never solve? Patterns beyond the shroud. Speculation begins in chemistry. Linen carries cellulose, layered with impurities, oils, and burial spices. A thin carbohydrate film on the fibers could be vulnerable to oxidation. Perhaps a brief burst of energy dehydrated only that layer, leaving microns of yellowing. If distance modulated the burst, then intensity could map across the cloth. Yet ultraviolet light burns too deeply and heat diffuses too slowly. Corona discharges work superficially, but blur the edges. Can any combination meet all conditions? Superficiality, soft outlines, distance gradients, and centuries of stability. Physics offers other paths. Could electrostatic fields across the cloth alter the crowns of fibers while sparing the cores? Might a brief plasma event etch the surface more delicately than heat? Laboratory experiments produce hints, but not the whole picture. Each method solves one piece while breaking another. Is the puzzle unsolvable? Or have researchers not yet found the right balance? What tool can burn so shallowly and so precisely without destroying the linen beneath? Some look backward. Could medieval artisans have stumbled upon a lost proto-photographic technique? Low-relief sculptures, chemical washes, and sunlight might produce an image that mimics shading. 1898, the first photograph is taken of the shroud. But careful study reveals no pigment binders, no deep penetration, no signs of diffusion typical of paint or dyes. If it was art, where are the traces? Can any known technique create a negative image with three-dimensional intensity mapping? If not, what does that absence mean? Bolder theories reach further. What if the shroud records a single energy event at burial? Radiation structured by the body itself. To believers, this whispers miracle. To scientists, it signals an undefined variable. The point is not to prove the claim, but to ask, would such an event leave measurable byproducts? If so, where should we look? If not, does the question move from science into philosophy? Which side of that divide are we willing to stand on? Information theory offers another frame. The shroud's image behaves like a signal. Its faint geometry like a carrier wave. If it is a signal, then it is not merely a picture, but a record. Compression tests could reveal whether the image is robust or fragile, whether it rests on simple laws or delicate balances. Is the shroud a smooth decay captured in linen, or does it hide more data we lack the code to read? Could AI one day decode it, not as an image, but as information preserved in threads? A better question. Every investigation that stalls on answers must fall in love with questions. The right question is not who, but how, not when, but what process. The shroud has trained generations to argue identities and dates. The machine trained us to argue order. What kind of order appears when an image forms without pigment and with superficiality so slight that breath would seem to move it? What kind of order persists under ultraviolet and visible both? What kind of order ignores stains that arrived by a different route? Some viewers will crave closure. They will ask whether this is proof of divinity or proof of forgery. The sober reply is that it is proof of neither. It is evidence that the image formation is more rule-bound than we thought. That admission is a gift. It turns spectacle into experiment. It invites physics students to take an interest. It invites chemists to consider carbohydrate layers as reaction sites. It invites engineers to design gentle energy sources for linen. It invites custodians to consider whether new non-destructive sampling can be allowed, if the results would answer long-standing objections without harming the relic. The better question also asks about humility. What if we cannot reproduce the image soon? Do we move on, or do we accept that some puzzles deserve decades? The shroud will not decay into uselessness while we hesitate. It has lasted through fire and flood and insult. It can last through a careful program of measurement. Here, AI can guide priority. Map where geometry is strongest. Map where intensity mapping is weakest. Map where weave distortions matter. Propose the smallest interventions that could test a hypothesis. The machine becomes not an oracle, but a planner. The better question also whispers about danger. What if the structure we see is not an accident of cloth and chemistry, but an intentional design? If order is there, then so is authorship, and authorship invites motives. Was it devotion, deception, or demonstration? Every path unsettles. A medieval artisan with techniques lost to history would unsettle. A burst of natural radiation unknown to physics would unsettle. A sign left in linen to challenge centuries would unsettle most of all. The danger is that the more precisely we ask, the more we risk finding that the cloth resists every category we trust. If this image has a cause, then patient minds will find it. If it does not, which would be unprecedented in the world of phenomena, it will continue to be a mirror where people see themselves. Believers seeing a sign and skeptics seeing a lesson in Credle. Either way, the work is worthy. The next chapter faces the fear at the center. The fear is not that the cloth proves too much. It is that it proves nothing while refusing to be ordinary. The terrifying possibility. Terrifying does not mean supernatural. It means category breaking. Scientists on private calls used the word because the more they looked, the less the shroud resembled anything they knew how to classify. Artifact or phenomena, tool or law. When a thing refuses to join a class, it becomes a threat to method because method prefers to sort before it measures. The shroud asks for a different posture. Measure first, sort later. That is difficult when centuries of argument press on your shoulders. Imagine accepting that the image behaves like a phenomenon without naming the phenomenon. It means building experiments whose failure does not discredit the whole case. It means publishing negative results with the same zeal as positive ones, because each failure narrows the field. It means that words like miracle and hoax stay on the bench while energy and oxidation and superficiality take the field. It means that every time you are tempted to leap, you force yourself to write a constraint. There is another terror that lives on the other side of wonder. What if we were never meant to reduce this? That sentence is dangerous because it can excuse laziness. Yet it has a kernel that resonates with the experience of many researchers who have tried and failed to make the linen speak the language of our laboratories. 16th century cloth and 1st century cloth, and the data that on the cloth matches that theory. If the shroud is the residue of an unrepeatable moment, language may always lag it by a beat. That is not a surrender. 'Tis a patience that sets young scientists free to try anyway, without promising them the power to close the case. The hook that moves us to the end is sober and kind. We might be walking toward a cause. We might be walking toward acceptance that a cause remains unnamed. In both cases, the walk matters. The shroud has already given science a gift by forcing it to talk to faith without shouting. It has given faith a gift by forcing it to respect measurement without fear. That is worth cherishing before we ask for more. The Shroud of Turin has been a relic, hoax, icon, and puzzle. Now it is also a data set that taught AI humility. The machine did not solve it, but confirmed its strangeness. Shallow penetration, geometry without pigment, intensity that maps to distance. It refused to date the cloth or prove theology, but it issued a challenge. If it is an artifact, show the tool. If it is a phenomenon, show the law. There is an order here that exceeds our explanation. That is not frightening. It is beautiful. It keeps the doors open, inviting young scientists, fresh experiments, and reverence for truth. What do you think this order points to? Which constraint would you test first? If you believe mysteries deserve care, subscribe and stay. The next artifact, the next light, may finally reveal how linen captured a moment beyond our reach.